some of the contract killers that have actually been caught and convicted are the most unassuming characters you would ever dream.
Won't stand out in a crowd.
Absolutely.
Yeah, flat cap, short coat, carry a bag, little woody in his mouth, thinking that you think he was going to bookies, you had to put a bet on, but he's there to kill you.
Hello and welcome back to Crime Suspect. Each week we'll be unravelling some of the UK's most prolific crimes, as well as providing in-depth analysis on the criminality that plagues our nation. On the show today, where money meets murder. From high-profile hits to cases that have baffled investigators for years, we delve into the murky and murderous underworld of Britain's deadly assassins. Next up, we'll be bringing you the best and worst of policing with our good cop, bad cop. And finally, it's your chance to book a crook as we show you this week's Wanted. Joining me for all of this today is former West Midlands Police Detective with over 20 years' experience of serious crime, organised crime, homicide investigations, virtually the whole lot, Nick Mills. Criminologist and author James Treadwell, and a gangster, formerly known as the Devil, but now known as the Fighting Preacher, Stephen French. Thank you all very much for being here. Now, you have the right to remain watching. This is Crime Suspect. From high-stakes hits ordered by organised crime gangs to more personal vendettas, the business of murder for hire is as complex as it is deadly. In Britain, hitmen are said to sometimes be hired for as little as £200, while a disturbing number of murder for hire websites also offer contract killings in exchange for cryptocurrency. Over the years, we've seen numerous deaths at the hand of lethal hits. And just a few weeks ago, alleged assassin Amy Betrow shocked the nation when she was unmasked as the hitwoman hired to carry out the contract killing of a family member in a revenge execution in Birmingham. Stephen, we've seen the movies, the TV shows, read the books. Everybody thinks they know something about a hitman. What is the reality, please?
It's an interesting question. As an individual, I've had an £80,000 contract placed on my own life. I was a pretty well-known person when I was a young man, right? And people would go up to a nightclub, and they'd say, I know Stephen French, and try to gain entry. And if they didn't get entry, and they'd say, well, I'll be back with Frenchy. Frenchy's my mate. And they said, there was a guy called Dave Smith. He worked for the 051 crew, which was another security firm in Liverpool. And that evening, his house was set on fire. Some children were injured. I originally thought one of the children died. The children didn't die. But because my name was mentioned, a spate of petrol bombings took place. And my house, I was in my house and I was petrol bombed. You have a thing called an Osman warning. An Osman warning, as the detective will verify, is when the police receive intelligence that your life is in danger, and they are duty-bound to come and tell you that your life's in danger. So they explained to me, and I asked them this question: is it Mickey Mouse or is it King Kong? In other words, do I have to be worried, or is it just more white noise? They said the intelligence is very serious. We can't give you any further information. We have to let you know that. Well, I managed to then persuade the young man whose house was firebombed, whose children were burnt, to meet me at British Home Stores with my brother and his friend, and explain to him, that you don't understand my pedigree. I don't go to people's houses. If I've got a trouble with man, I'll have the trouble with the man in the streets. It wasn't me. I was in prison. Later on, I was in prison. A friend of mine wrote to me, asking me for forgiveness. And he wasn't my friend at the time. He explained to me that he was sent to Ireland to procure contract killers to come over and kill me for £30,000. This is how I started to get the information.
Right.
So I was wrongly blamed. I was wrongly blamed, and I was targeted by a serious group.
Wrongly blamed, falsely accused. Somebody goes to Ireland to bring somebody over to assassinate you.
Correct.
Now, it didn't happen, thankfully.
Yeah.
And clearly you're here today. Nick, in all your years as a detective, are these tales that you're familiar with, that you've heard, or have you investigated these kind of cases?
Yeah, you hear these things all the time, and Stephen says the intelligence comes in. We can't always disclose the details of that intelligence, but where it's credible, where we have, there is a credible threat to someone's life, obviously the police have a duty, and they've come and spoken to you and told you about that. But actually progressing that into to a point where you can identify an individual who's going to commit that crime, or even in the aftermath identify that a contract killing has taken place. It's very, very difficult. You've effectively got 3 investigations in one. You have the actual killing itself, you have the investigation you have into the victim and why it's taken place. But if that's carried out by a third party, until you can link all 3, the case is very difficult. And you look at sort of historic cases. There was a case in Birmingham where a drug dealer was shot 15 times with an Uzi submachine gun. And as the offender walked away, he dropped his hat. And that's the key, really, with contract killers. There's a mistake made. That's the only time they come to notice, because this man, 4 years later, was actually arrested for something he didn't do. He was suspected of an offence and was ended up not charged with it, but he gave his DNA. And it came back that it was his DNA in the hat 4 years later. And when we looked at him, the guy had no previous convictions. He never come to notice to the police. He got some income perhaps that he couldn't explain. But apart from that, and when he was arrested, he'd got the loaded Uzi submachine gun under his pillow.
That he'd used in the contract killing?
That was actually the actual gun that had been used 4 years before. I
take it you weren't able to pin any other cases on him?
No, and that was the unusual thing. We couldn't pin any other crimes on him, but what we did find was what we loosely would describe as a receipt book for jobs that he'd done, things that he'd committed. But again, not enough evidence to be able to put any other offences to him.
James, people that carry out killings for cash, as we've heard, can be notoriously difficult to capture. Let's just go through some that may or may not have been done by professional assassins. Jill Dando, 1999, incredibly famous case. Frank McPhee in Glasgow in 2000, shot from some considerable distance by a sniper, unsolved as well. Alistair Wilson, 2004, in Nairn in Scotland, a case in which I have a huge and ongoing interest, stubbornly unsolved. Jamie Starkey, Liverpool, 2012, and the Al Hilly family in France, 2012. So they can't surely all be committed by the same kind of killer, can they? Do these contract killers vary?
There is some variation between them, but I think there's also a lot of familiarity and commonality that probably overlaps with all of them as well. And this is where I think perhaps the academic literature does get it a little bit wrong. I mean, the first thing to say is, although we've just talked about a number of cases, they are actually going to be pretty rare against the communal run of murder, and people fail to kind of appreciate it. Most murders are incredibly easy to solve, as Nick will tell you. You go to the nearest and dearest and arrest them, because the person who's going to be responsible is going to be the husband, the partner, the wife. The small number of these sorts of killings, and it is a relatively small number if we consider them, are kind of marked out because there isn't an obvious reason for the offence. There isn't an obvious link between the victim and their death, and sometimes that also spirals. So you get families involved in the case of, the murder in the Alps, for example. It looks more, and there are questions whether it was actually the cyclist Sylvian Moller or the family that were ultimately the victims. Very, very difficult to know. The thing that's quite interesting about all of these cases, though, is when you look to the commonalities, what is certainly needed is some sort of criminal connection to be successful, to get away with it. And although, as Nick rightly says, offenders make mistakes, Now, the academic literature that puts out essentially that there are 4 types of hitmen or contract killers that start off with the kind of novice who would be the sort of £200 killer armed with the firearm that's given to them, you know, often young, inexperienced, the kind of novice sort, through to the masterful sort, the kind of character that's almost understanding of the military experienced, shadowy hitman, perhaps linked to, for example, paramilitary organisations or political violence. That's a part of it. The ones we haven't talked about as well, and this doesn't come into the British academic literature, is of course there can be state involvement in these things. We've seen Salisbury, for example, where you've got very sophisticated and experienced actors from foreign governments, perhaps.
The Russians, the 2 Russians that came over and poisoned. Yeah.
And similarly, you know, we've got a number of unsolved and very questionable kind of high-profile cases where it's clear that people did not meet their end at their own hand. If we think, for example, about MI6 agent Gareth Williams you know, so now, of course, criminals run a continuum, and those who are going to be very heavily involved in the criminal world, and Stephen gave a great example of what that looks like earlier on. It's very often a world of violent men. It's door scenes, it's drug dealing, it's it's armed robbery. Those things require access to firearms. They require a knowledge of other criminals. And floating around in that world very often are your archetypal characters who have no fear of taking a couple of £1,000 to be involved in essentially taking someone's life who isn't known to them.
And James, the main currency that is violence. It's like where you live and what kind of watch you wear. Yeah, you're right. If you're living in a council estate, you're going to have a £200 watch on. Yeah, right. If you're living in the Hollywood Hills, you're going to have a 50 grand, 60 grand watch on. Yeah, right. And that's the type of killer you're going to be able to afford, because it's always at the root of all contract killings is an offence to somebody. Yeah, and we can all be offended in different social stratas as we go up, and from the average and very poor, where a lot of violence takes place, right up to the very affluent, right. I'm put in mind of JFK, Jack Ruby, and their involvement in all that, because I'm convinced that was a contract killing, right, and I'm convinced that the guy was put up as a patsy. He couldn't make the shot, right. So it's. But the underlying factor, just to reiterate James' point, is violence, right? And it all depends which social stratification you're in, that how you would deal with your offence.
If we were to take 100 murders, for example, would you think that maybe 1 in 100 is carried out by somebody who's been paid to do that killing, or are they even less frequent than that?
It's really difficult to say, because murder, homicide investigation, and having worked on quite a few over the years, homicide generally relates to another criminal enterprise. So if you have a domestic abuse homicide, you're investigating a domestic abuse case.
Yeah.
If you have someone who's shot at the scene of an armed robbery, you're investigating a gang of armed robbers. Whereas with a contract killing, you're investigating a death.
Yeah.
The criminal enterprise behind it is a conspiracy, and that's very difficult to get to unless you can very quickly identify the motive, and even then you've then got to link that motive to people and find the one in the middle. It's very difficult to say. And James, you mentioned earlier the number of cases that are unsolved, and yes, questionably they would all be potential contract killings, but we'll maybe we'll never know.
I mean, that was only a short list of cases that I have knowledge of, that just off the top of my head.
Interestingly enough, though, in the research and the reading that I've done, right, I've seen, that 9 in 10 killings, the person murdered, they're murdered by someone that knows them. Yeah, right. So I do believe it's a very small percentage, a tiny percentage. I believe that you could even be right. It wouldn't be a bad guesstimate to say 1 in 100 is a paid killer.
But of course, the worrying thing is, with those cases that I've mentioned, and I could have drawn up a far, far lengthier list of unsolved cases that appear to have been committed by a contract killer, that killer is free. unless they've been caught for some other crime. They're on the streets. They could do it again. So doesn't that make that sort of...
No, it's exactly as the officer said. Yeah, right. It's the conspiracy. Yeah, right. So now, yeah, right. If you want me to kill your wife, yeah, so you can get...
I don't.
No, to get the insurance. It's an example. I know you don't. You've told me you're a very happily married man.
Thank you.
And she's a wonderful woman. Yeah. But just for an example, yeah, there's only me and you that know. And if it stays that way, what chance do the police have got of finding out anything? And
of course, with all these circumstances as well, you're then looking at the articulated reason that's given as well. So I remember talking to a guy in a high security prison, and he said it's really interesting because the rationale behind why I'm here isn't the reason at all. He'd been involved in a drive-by shooting, and he said we did it, I banged to rights and I'm serving the time out. But the reason that they gave for this was that it was to do with a dispute over drugs money, and that I shot this guy over that. It wasn't that at all. It was to do with the fact that he was having an affair with my partner's Cody, so my Cody partner. Co-defendant's partner. Yeah. So he'd crossed the line, totally unacceptable. He was going to be wiped out for that, so that's why it happened. So it had nothing to do with... The drugs were all secondary,
a crime of passion, not a crime of pound notes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Then, just to reiterate James's point, yeah. In 2013, I was given 6 years jail. I got cut down to 4, and I did 2. I pistol whipped somebody at Liverpool City Centre. Yeah, right. I pleaded guilty, so I could get my sentence cut. Yeah, right. The reason that was put across was I was bullying another businessman. The actualities of it was, yeah, right. He wouldn't fight me in a fair fight. He threatened my sister. He threatened my daughter, and he threatened to kill me. Yeah, right. I wasn't going to go to the police, so I pistol whipped him. I went to jail. Yeah, and he went. But the reason behind it was totally wrong.
So, are we saying that sometimes the reasons that are put into the media or speculated about in the media because of these cases could be way off the mark, Nick?
Absolutely. The example I gave earlier, I'm still to this day have no idea whatsoever why that killing took place. I know it was a hitman, and we know that it was on someone who was involved in drugs criminality, but aside from that, we still know the why.
Just for the viewers' sake, yeah, right. There's a case that we can talk about quickly because the killer's now out. Yeah, he was a contract killer. Yeah, right. His name was Derek Bakoran. Yeah, he killed Kevin Maguire and Nathan Jones in a gym. He attended the gym for a while. Yeah, right. And the reasons given for it was a dispute between those, but it was a contract killing. Yeah, right. They used to do what I used to do, which was tax drug dealers. Yeah, right. They taxed, let's call him Mr. X, because it was Mr. X that paid for the killing. Yeah, right. Mr. X was arrested 7 times. Yeah, Mr. X had to be released 7 times. This is why I can't call his name.
Because and has he ever been charged in connection with
He will never be charged. Derek McCorrin has always denied it was a contract killing. He always denied that he did it, and he was seen on the crime. Yeah, right. Now, in the upper echelons of the underworld, we all know what it was about. Yeah, it was over them taking money off Mr. X. Yeah. And they went to Mr. X once. He said, I'll give you this amount of money. Don't ever come back to me again. Leave me alone, or I'll put twice as much of that money on your heads to kill you. And allegedly, I say allegedly, to cover myself, he did. But the police couldn't prove that.
James, apart from it being very worrying that sometimes these contracts, as we've heard, are impossible to unpick, or should I say, prove, can I have some insight, please, into that mindset, the psychology, the background and the type of person that for money would go and murder someone?
They're quite often offenders who are on the scene but peripheral to the sort of organised crime scene, that have been around it for years and years and years. They're more so the sort of journeyman category of our are types that essentially have been involved in criminality, but often not detected very much. They can get access to firearms. They know people. They can run the stock in trade, but actually their ability to kind of fly under the radar for long periods is what marks them out.
So they're quite a successful criminal.
They can be quite successful criminals. And I think what's quite interesting about them is, rather than being the more sort of gregarious and characters that kind of come to the fore, they're pretty nondescript, actually. They're the people that fly under the radar a lot of the times. They're quite insular. They're quite focused on themselves and sometimes not very relatable to others.
James's point. Some of the contract killers that have actually been caught and convicted are the most unassuming characters you would ever dream.
Won't stand out in a crowd.
Absolutely.
Yeah, flat cap, short coat, carry a bag. Yeah. Little Woody in his mouth, thinking that you think he was going to bookies, you had to put a bet on, but he's there to kill you.
Like the man who dropped his hat.
Absolutely. The CCTV shows him calmly walking away and never to be seen again. And had he not been identified as... Well, his DNA was taken because he was identified as being involved in a fight, and it was a case of mistaken identity. But, of course, when he was arrested, his DNA was taken.
It's interesting you should say that, because it was at the time, a time came, the police brought in a new law. Yeah, and even if you got arrested, they could take your DNA
and not charge.
And they never had my DNA. Yeah, you're right. And I got arrested for something that I never done. Yeah, my DNA came forward, and thank God nothing came back.
On that note, because this is Crime Suspect, not True Crime Confessions, I'm going to say a huge thank you to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right, moving on to this week's Cop Watch. This week, we shine the good cop spotlight on police constables Aaron Kincaid and James Blundell for their quick thinking in saving a girl's life who was choking on a sweet. PC Kincaid sprang into action using his training to dislodge the sweet and reassure the girl before paramedics arrived. Meanwhile, PC Blundell kept the parents calm during the incident. The young girl was taken to the hospital as a precaution. PC Kincaid said, "We're both glad we were in the right place at the right time." Well done, gentlemen. This week's bad cop is former Chief Constable of Northamptonshire, Nick Adderley, who proves that no one is above the law. Adderley has been sacked for gross misconduct after lying about his military record. As the Chief Constable, he was suspended on full pay since October for offences of exaggerating his rank and service length and falsely claiming military achievements. Among the allegations that were proved was that he implied that he served in the Falklands War by wearing a particular medal, despite the fact that he was just 15 years old when the conflict started in 1982. Yet another, I'm afraid, appalling failure on the part of British police, and I'm hugely glad that Walter Mitty Adderley will never serve in policing again. All right, it's time for the part of the show where we bring you the mugs of thugs who are terrorising our streets. But firstly, some success. Following one of our recent appeals, Cook, who was wanted in relation to an allegation of threats being made and a burglary offence, was located and arrested by Gloucestershire Police. Thanks to everyone who shared our appeal or called him with information. Now, moving on to this week's Wanted. Have you seen these suspects? First up, Met detectives are appealing for help in urgently finding a man who tried to rape a woman in West Ham. The man approached the woman, then followed her before grabbing her from behind and attempting to rape her. He is described as white, 5'8" tall, of medium build, with dark hair and a beard. Next, have you seen wanted man Alexandre? Surrey police officers are asking for your help to find 42-year-old Alexandre de Silva Amarelli, who is wanted for burglary and theft from a car in Epsom. Alexandre is described as white, around 6 foot tall, with cropped brown hair and a beard. Lastly, Greater Manchester Police are appealing for witnesses to help identify a suspect after a £10,500 Hublot watch was stolen in Manchester city centre. The victim was approached by 2 men. One grabbed his wrist, swiped the watch and then pushed him to the ground, leaving him injured. If you think you know or have seen any of these crooks, get in touch anonymously with Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Right, that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks to Nick, James and Stephen. Be sure to leave us a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week for more Crime Suspects.